The year was 1866, and the night carried the sound of rain against the roof, steady and unrelenting, as if the heavens themselves were marking the moment with sorrow. Inside a dimly lit cabin, Sarah Harlow labored through the birth of her child. Her body trembled with exhaustion, yet her spirit endured in silence. Beside her stood Ezekiel, her husband, tall and severe, eyes fixed on her as though watching not a woman in pain, but a vessel fulfilling a prophecy. He spoke words from Scripture under his breath, his voice firm, unwavering, as though the birth of their child was not a private joy but a divine mandate. The baby's cry pierced the room, fragile yet alive, and Sarah felt tears rise unbidden, not of relief but of a longing she could not name. Ezekiel held the child for a moment, lifting it high with solemnity, declaring that God had blessed them with another soul to serve his will. His voice was heavy like iron, and the women gathered to help nodded with reverence. Sarah lay back, chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the tiny face she would cradle later. In that instant, she knew this child was not hers alone. Ezekiel had already claimed it for his vision, another thread woven into his doctrine. Ezekiel had begun as a simple man with fiery sermons, preaching in the open air to farmers and laborers, men who longed for meaning in their hardscrabble lives. His words carried a strange power, turning despair into devotion. Over time, the poor and the desperate gathered around him, seeking hope. He offered them a new order, a life built on discipline, obedience, and separation from the sinful world beyond. They gave their faith, their labor, their savings, and in return Ezekiel gave them certainty. Sarah watched this with quiet dread, for she saw in her husband not a shepherd of souls, but a man who had learned how easily faith could be bent into chains. The first families arrived in wagons. Weary and hopeful, clutching children and meager belongings, Ezekiel welcomed them with open arms, promising them shelter and purpose. Cabins rose on the land, rough-hewn logs stacked by calloused hands, until the wilderness seemed to bend itself into a settlement. He called it a refuge, a kingdom of the faithful, where sin could not reach them. The followers believed him, and they worked from dawn until their bodies ached, singing hymns that echoed across the fields. Sarah moved among them, offering what comfort she could, though her heart grew heavier each day. Within the walls of their home, Ezekiel demanded silence, obedience, and reverence. Sarah learned to keep her thoughts locked away, for even a flicker of doubt in her eyes could draw his suspicion. He spoke often of sacrifice, of how the faithful must give not just their possessions, but their very selves. His words were honeyed in public, but in private they hardened into commands that allowed no resistance. He told Sarah her role was sacred, that she was chosen to stand beside him. Yet she felt less a partner than a shadow, present but voiceless. The children of the settlement, including her own, grew under his stern hand. They rose before dawn, their prayers long, their work longer. Mistakes were punished swiftly, sometimes with a cutting word, sometimes with harsher means. Ezekiel called it discipline, but Sarah saw fear in their small faces. At night, when the children lay beside her, she would stroke their hair and whisper gentle words she dared not speak in daylight. Those stolen moments of tenderness were her only rebellion, a way of holding on to the fragments of love that Ezekiel could not crush. The settlement grew in strength and number, and with it Ezekiel's confidence swelled. He preached not just to his followers but to himself, as if each word confirmed the destiny he believed was his. He spoke of visions, of divine voices that guided his every command. The people listened in awe, but Sarah knew those visions were born not of heaven but of ambition. She saw how his eyes gleamed when they bowed before him, how his hands tightened on the pulpit as though clinging to power itself. One night, after another long sermon that left the followers trembling with devotion, Sarah sat alone by the fire. The flames flickered, shadows dancing along the walls, and she thought of the life she once had before Ezekiel. She remembered laughter that rang free, the touch of her mother's hand, the scent of wildflowers in the fields where she had played as a girl. Those memories felt distant, fragile as cobwebs, yet they reminded her that she had once belonged to herself. Now she belonged to him, and through him, to the endless demands of his doctrine. The rain outside grew heavier, pressing against the windows, and Sarah listened to the sound with an ache in her chest. She thought of the child sleeping in the cradle beside her, tiny and unknowing, already claimed by a father's vision. She wondered if there would ever be a way to break the circle, to give her children more than sermons and fear. For now, she remained silent, a quiet witness in a house filled with echoes of scripture twisted into chains. Yet in her silence, something stirred, faint as the first breath of wind before a storm. The first part of her journey was not marked by open defiance or words spoken aloud. It was marked by endurance, by the quiet strength of a woman who carried her doubts like hidden embers. Sarah did not yet know how those embers would one day ignite, but she held them close, waiting, watching, and enduring, as Ezekiel's kingdom began to rise around her like a fortress built on faith and fear. The settlement stood like an island cut off from the world, its wooden cabins pressed together under the weight of obedience. Days bled into one another with the rhythm of labor and prayer, until time itself felt owned by Ezekiel's voice. He spoke as if the earth belonged to him, as if the sun rose at his command. Men bent their backs in the fields, women stitched and cooked, children moved in quiet lines, and every gesture was measured against his will. It was a life that left no room for laughter, no space for the softness of joy. Even the wind that moved through the trees seemed to hush when Ezekiel raised his hand. Sarah watched all of it from within the small circle of her own silence. She had learned that silence was safer than words, for words could betray her thoughts, and thoughts, if noticed, could betray her soul. She knew how quickly suspicion grew here. A glance held too long, a sigh heard at the wrong moment, a hesitation in repeating Ezekiel's commands. Any of these could mark a person as weak in faith. And weakness was punished. Sometimes punishment was only harsh words before the congregation, but other times it was harsher still, leaving scars that did not fade. At night, the settlement became a place of shadows. Families gathered in their cabins, lamps flickering low, whispering prayers Ezekiel had taught them. But within their whispers, Sarah sometimes caught other sounds, the muffled sobs of women, the restless cries of children who longed for freedom they had never known. She wanted to reach for them, to offer comfort beyond Scripture, but fear held her still. If anyone saw kindness that did not echo Ezekiel's teachings, it could be twisted into rebellion. And rebellion was unforgivable. Ezekiel himself changed as the settlement grew. He had once been a man whose sermons carried the raw edge of desperation, but now his voice was polished, heavy with certainty, as if he spoke not from faith, but from authority. He no longer walked among his followers as one of them. He stood above them, his every word a decree, his every glance a judgment. His sermons stretched long into the night, his arms raised toward heaven while the people swayed, caught in the web of his conviction. Sarah sat among them, her face calm, but inside she felt each word like a chain tightening around her chest. Her children grew under his watch. They woke before dawn to pray, their small voices trembling in the cold air. They carried wood, fetched water, and recited verses until their eyes drooped with fatigue. Sarah tried to shield them with moments of tenderness, brushing their hair, humming lullabies so softly that only they could hear. These were stolen acts of love, secret sparks she guarded fiercely, because she knew Ezekiel wanted even their dreams to belong to him. She feared what would happen when her children grew old enough to lose the softness of childhood, when discipline would carve into them more deeply than her whispers ever could. The people whispered of miracles Ezekiel performed, though Sarah saw none. A sick man claimed he had been healed after Ezekiel's prayers, though he still limped across the fields. A woman said her crops grew twice as fast, though Sarah saw her kneeling longer in the dirt, hands raw and bleeding. Yet the people believed, because belief was easier than doubt, and Ezekiel fed their need with stories of visions that grew more elaborate with every telling. He said angels spoke to him in the night. He said God had chosen him to build a new kingdom, and the people, weary and hungry for hope, gave themselves to him entirely. There were nights Sarah thought of leaving. She would sit by the fire after Ezekiel had gone to preach, the children sleeping against her, and imagine walking into the dark woods beyond the settlement. She would imagine carrying her children through the trees until the settlement's walls vanished behind her. But each time the thought came, fear smothered it. The woods were endless, and she had no map. The world beyond was said to be wicked, cursed, filled with dangers she could not name. Ezekiel had made sure they believed there was no life beyond his reach. And even if she tried, she knew he would come after her. Ezekiel did not lose what he considered his. So Sarah remained, her silence a shield, her memories her only rebellion. She thought of the life before, of fields that were not owned by faith, of days when laughter was not a sin. These memories flickered like faint stars against the dark sky of her present. They gave her strength, though she told no one. She endured, because enduring was the only power she had left. Yet even in her endurance, something stirred. A small ember of defiance lived deep within her, quiet but alive, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The second part of her life in the settlement was not marked by great events or open resistance. It was marked by survival, by carrying hope in secret while the walls around her grew higher. Sarah lived each day like a shadow moving through Ezekiel's kingdom, unseen yet enduring, guarding the fragile flame within her heart. What she did not yet know was that even the strongest walls can crack, and even the quietest embers can grow into fire. The years passed, and the settlement no longer looked like a handful of cabins pressed together in the wilderness. It had grown into a small village, with fences stretching wide, fields spreading under the sun, and a chapel built from logs at its center, towering like a monument to Ezekiel's ambition. Every board was nailed with the sweat of his followers, every stone dragged by hands that believed their work was holy. Ezekiel stood in the pulpit, his voice carrying across the wooden walls, and the people looked at him as if he were more than a man. His sermons no longer spoke only of survival but of destiny, of a chosen people meant to endure until the world beyond withered away in sin. Sarah sat in the back of the chapel, her children at her side, her face calm though her spirit trembled. She had grown skilled at wearing stillness like a cloak. To anyone watching, she appeared dutiful, listening, nodding, her eyes lowered in reverence. But inside, each word pressed against her like a weight, crushing and unrelenting. Ezekiel spoke of sacrifice, of how the faithful must give all that they were to God, and Sarah knew he meant to himself. She saw how his eyes lingered on the crowd, how he swelled when they bowed their heads. She knew the kingdom he built was not for God, but for his hunger to rule. Her children were growing, and with every year Sarah felt her fear for them deepen. Her eldest son now stood tall enough to carry the weight of Ezekiel's commands. His back bent under long hours in the fields, his hands rough before they had ever known the softness of youth. Her daughter recited verses with a voice steady and clear, but Sarah saw the exhaustion behind her eyes, the way her small fingers clenched at her dress as though holding herself together. She wondered if they even remembered the world beyond the settlement, the wildflowers and rivers she once knew. For them, this closed life was all they had, and that thought hollowed her heart. Whispers began to move through the settlement, though none spoke them aloud where Ezekiel could hear. A woman had tried to leave, they said, slipping away at night with her youngest child. By morning, Ezekiel's men had found her, dragged her back, her face pale with terror. She stood before the congregation, her body trembling, while Ezekiel's voice thundered about betrayal and weakness. He said her soul had nearly been lost to the world, and that only God's mercy, through him, had brought her back. The woman nodded, tears running down her face, but Sarah knew what she saw in those eyes was not redemption, but brokenness. The lesson was clear. There was no way out. Sarah's own longing for escape grew sharper after that. She began to measure the distance to the woods each time she walked to the river, to notice which nights the guards were drowsy at their posts, to imagine routes she might take if she ever found the courage. But each time the thought flared, it was smothered by fear. Fear of the wilderness, fear of Ezekiel, fear of what might happen to her children if they were caught. She could not risk their lives on the fragile hope of freedom. So she folded her dreams into silence, hiding them where no one could touch them. Ezekiel's power reached into every corner of their lives. He dictated what they wore, what they ate, even how they loved. Couples were told when they could marry. Children were assigned tasks before they could even speak clearly, and no choice was truly theirs. Sarah wondered how long people could bend before they broke, how long faith could be stretched before it snapped. Yet they obeyed, not out of love but out of fear, and Ezekiel fed that fear like a fire that never burned out. One night, as Sarah sat by the fire with her children asleep beside her, she allowed herself to remember the sound of laughter, not the restrained smiles that sometimes flickered in the settlement, but the real kind, wild, free, unashamed. She remembered her mother's laughter, the way it had filled a room with warmth. It struck her then how long it had been since she had heard such a sound. This silence they lived in was not holy. It was suffocation, and she feared that if her children grew up never knowing joy, they would believe this was the only life that existed. The cracks in Ezekiel's kingdom were small, almost invisible, but Sarah noticed them. A man stumbled in his prayers one morning and was struck down with words so sharp they left him speechless for days. A child's mistake in the fields led to punishment too harsh for such small hands to bear. Sarah saw the way people's eyes flickered with doubt, even as their mouths repeated Ezekiel's words. They were afraid to speak, afraid even to think it aloud, but something was shifting beneath the surface. And Sarah held on to that thought, quiet as it was, that even the strongest walls can be shaken. The third part of her life in the settlement was one of watching, waiting, and carrying the weight of both love and fear. She guarded her children with all she had, though she knew her protection was fragile. She endured Ezekiel's commands with silence, though inside she carried a storm that grew with every passing day. And though she did not yet know when or how it would break, she began to feel the truth rising within her, that silence was no longer enough, and that one day the embers she carried would demand to be fire. Winter fell heavy that year, the kind of cold that gnawed at bones and left frost on every window pane. The settlement seemed quieter beneath the weight of snow, though the silence was not peace but a hush born of fear and exhaustion. The days were short, the nights endless, and still Ezekiel demanded labor from dawn until dark. He told the people that their suffering was holy, that each aching step and each shiver in the wind was a gift to God. They believed because they had nothing else left to hold on to, and their eyes grew dull as the weeks bled together. Sarah wrapped her children in every scrap of cloth she could find, holding them close when the winds screamed through the cracks in the walls. She whispered old songs into their ears, fragments from her childhood, trying to give them warmth no fire could bring. Yet even those songs felt dangerous, for Ezekiel called them worldly, and everything worldly was condemned. Still, she sang softly when no one was listening, because she could not let him strip away every piece of who she was. Food grew scarce, and hunger became a constant companion. Ezekiel stood in the chapel, speaking of faith that would feed them better than bread. He ate well enough, his plate never empty, while the families bowed their heads over bowls of thin broth and stale crusts. Sarah watched mothers break their own meals into pieces so their children would not go hungry, and she wondered how much longer hearts could endure such theft disguised as holiness. She knew Ezekiel's words were poison, but poison repeated often enough began to sound like truth, and she feared how deeply it had rooted itself in the minds of those around her. The punishments grew harsher as the cold pressed harder. A boy was caught sneaking food from the storehouse, and Ezekiel made him kneel in the snow until his lips turned blue. The others watched in silence, no one daring to intervene. Sarah's stomach twisted as she held her daughter's hand, whispering prayers not of devotion, but of protection. She wondered how many more children would suffer before someone broke. Yet no one moved, for fear held them tighter than chains. Ezekiel's sermons turned darker, filled with talk of enemies beyond their walls, of demons that longed to destroy them. He told them the world outside was diseased, that only he could keep them safe. The people clung to his words, their fear feeding his power. until the settlement felt less like a home and more like a cage. Sarah felt the walls close in with every passing day, her breaths shallow, her silence heavy. She knew she was not alone in her doubt, but doubt was dangerous, and no one dared to let it live beyond the space of a thought. One night, Sarah saw a shadow move past her window. Her heart raced, fearing discovery, but when she stepped outside, she found another woman waiting. Her name was Ruth, her face pale and her hands trembling. She whispered quickly, glancing over her shoulder, telling Sarah she wanted to leave. She had seen enough. She could not let her children grow up in chains. Her words were desperate, but her voice cracked with fear. Sarah felt her own longing rise like a tide, yet she shook her head. To leave was death, she told her, and to be caught was worse. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, and she slipped back into the dark without another word. Days later, Ruth was gone. Ezekiel called the congregation together, his voice thundering in the chapel, saying she had been taken by the evils of the world. He warned that her soul was lost, that anyone who dared to follow would meet the same fate. Sarah stood in the crowd, her heart pounding, but she caught the faintest flicker in the eyes of others, a question, a doubt, quickly hidden but there all the same. Ruth's absence left a hole, and in that hole grew the first fragile shoots of defiance. For Sarah, the winter became a season of secrets. She began to watch more closely, to notice who lowered their eyes in doubt, who hesitated in their prayers. She gathered these fragments silently, carrying them as proof that she was not alone. She still sang her quiet songs to her children, still measured the distance to the trees, still dreamed of freedom in the small hours of the night. The storm within her grew stronger, though she had not yet let it break. When the thaw finally came, the ground soft beneath the snow, Sarah stood in the fields with the sun on her face. She felt both relief and dread, for she knew another season of labor and sermons lay ahead. Yet something inside her had changed. The silence she had carried for so long no longer felt like endurance, but like chains she could not bear much longer. She held her daughter's hand and looked out at the horizon, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe there might be a world beyond the walls Ezekiel had built. The fourth chapter of her life under his rule was marked not by escape or rebellion, but by awakening. The cold had hardened her, the hunger had sharpened her, and the silence had begun to break. She knew the cost of freedom might be everything she had, but she also knew that to remain was to lose herself piece by piece until nothing was left. And as the settlement stirred from winter's grip, Sarah carried within her the quiet certainty that change was coming, carried not on Ezekiel's voice, but on the beating of her own heart. Spring brought a false gentleness, the kind that seemed to promise renewal yet carried shadows beneath its bloom. The fields came alive again, green shoots rising through dark earth, and the air filled with birdsong. To the settlers, it felt like proof of their faith, another sign that Ezekiel's path was the right one. He stood tall at the gatherings, his voice booming in the open air, telling them the land answered their obedience. Every stalk of grain, every drop of rain, was, in his words, a gift meant only for the faithful. The people bowed their heads and worked harder, their devotion deepening as the days stretched longer. Sarah saw beauty in the fields, but it was not the beauty Ezekiel preached. It was the quiet resilience of life itself, pushing upward despite the weight of frost and stone. She walked among the rows with her children, their small hands brushing the green shoots, and felt an ache inside her chest. The world beyond the walls of the settlement was still out there, alive and waiting, yet Ezekiel kept them caged with words of fear. She wondered if her children would ever know freedom, or if their entire lives would be spent bent over soil that was never truly theirs. The punishments continued, harsher than before, though wrapped in the language of love and discipline. Ezekiel claimed every correction was for the good of the soul, but Sarah saw how those corrections left bruises that faded slowly and spirits that never quite healed. She saw a girl no older than 12 stand trembling before him, accused of questioning his words, her eyes wide with terror. He spoke to the crowd of rebellion and sin, forcing the girl to beg forgiveness while everyone watched. Sarah's heart broke with every word, for she knew that silence in those moments was another form of violence. Yet no one dared speak. The longer Sarah lived in that silence, the more it became unbearable. At night, when the chapel lights still glowed and the hymns dragged on, she sat awake and thought of Ruth. She thought of the gap her absence had left, the whisper it had planted in the hearts of the others. Sarah clung to that whisper, nursing it quietly. She began to notice who looked away when Ezekiel preached, who hesitated before saying amen, who held their children a little tighter during the punishments. These small signs were fragile, yet to her they were more precious than gold. They meant she was not alone. One evening, while tending to the cooking fire, another woman lingered beside her. Her name was Miriam, her eyes hollowed by years of fear. She spoke in a voice so soft it barely carried over the crackle of flames, asking if Sarah remembered laughter, if she ever dreamed of a world beyond the settlement. Sarah's throat tightened, for no one had dared speak such things aloud. She nodded once, and Miriam's eyes filled with tears. Nothing more was said, but in that shared silence lay a bond, unspoken yet powerful. It was the first step toward trust, and Sarah felt the ember inside her stir brighter. Ezekiel sensed the shifting winds, though he misread them as signs of greater devotion. His sermons grew longer, his demands sharper. He ordered more fasts, more vigils, more sacrifices of comfort, insisting they were being tested by God. He held them longer in prayer houses, where the air grew stifling and the people swayed with exhaustion. Sarah watched their bodies bend, their minds blur, and still they repeated his words as if clinging to them would keep them alive. Yet beneath their trembling voices, she began to hear something else, a weariness that was turning into quiet rebellion. Her own children grew more restless. Her eldest son once asked why they could not walk past the borders of the fields, why they never visited the towns they had left behind. Sarah hushed him quickly, fear flashing through her, but the question lodged itself in her heart. She knew others must wonder the same, even if they dared not say it aloud. The thought filled her with both dread and hope. Dread because she knew Ezekiel would crush such thoughts if he heard them, and hope because it meant the walls he had built were beginning to crack. One night, when the sky was clear and the stars stretched endless above, Sarah stepped outside alone. The air smelled of earth and grass, fresh with spring, and she felt a longing so deep it almost tore her apart. She thought of her childhood, of fields where she ran free without fear of who might be watching. She thought of her mother's voice, her laughter, the sound of church bells ringing from a town far away. For a moment, she let herself believe that life still waited for her beyond this cage, that freedom was not only a dream, but a possibility. By the time she returned inside, something within her had shifted. She could not say it aloud, but she knew. The settlement was no longer just Ezekiel's kingdom. It was a place where seeds of doubt had taken root, where silence was thinning, where fear no longer held absolute power. Sarah's role was still quiet, still hidden, but it was changing. She was no longer only enduring. She was preparing, carrying within her the weight of something greater than fear. The fifth season of her story was one of awakening not just in herself, but in those around her. The soil beneath their feet had begun to crack, the frost breaking under the warmth of spring. Ezekiel still stood tall, but his voice no longer filled the air without question. Sarah felt it in her bones, in the stolen glances and whispered silences. Change was coming, carried not by sermons, but by the quiet courage of hearts that had endured too much. And in that knowledge, she found strength she never thought she could hold. The truth, once it was finally laid bare, felt like a storm that had no end. It swept through every corner of the room, rattling the walls of silence that had stood for so long. No one spoke at first, but the weight of what had been said hung in the air like smoke after fire. It was as if every person present had been stripped of their armor, left raw and exposed. The pain of betrayal had already cut deep, but this was something far sharper, something that pierced straight into the bone. No one wanted to look at one another, yet every glance held questions that no one had the strength to answer. The minutes stretched like hours, and still no one moved. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the faint ticking of the clock sounded heavier, dragging each second like it carried its own burden. Finally, a voice broke through, low and shaking, trying to put reason where none existed. The words did little to soothe. Instead, they cracked the surface even more, spilling out emotions that had been carefully hidden. The quietness that followed was even louder than before, because now it was filled with the knowledge that nothing could ever return to how it once was. It became clear that the truth had been living in the shadows for far too long, feeding on silence, waiting for the moment it would consume everything. And now it had. The walls felt smaller, closing in, as if the house itself could not bear the truth it was forced to hold. The air was thick, every breath heavy with grief, every heartbeat dragging guilt and sorrow with it. No one had been ready, but perhaps no one ever truly could have been ready for something like this. A storm inside each heart began to rage, pulling memories to the surface. Every moment, every word, every choice was now painted in a different color. What once seemed innocent now looked tainted. What once felt like love now seemed like deception. The hardest part was not just the betrayal itself, but realizing how much had been lost in the process. Trust, faith, the very foundation of what once tied them all together. Some wanted to scream, others wanted to collapse into silence, but neither option gave relief. The feelings kept building, like waves crashing one after another, leaving behind nothing but wreckage. It was not a single wound, but 1,000 small cuts, each one reminding them of how fragile everything had been all along. Anger began to simmer beneath the grief, hot and restless, searching for someone to blame. And yet, the blame could not rest on just one set of shoulders. It spread like fire, touching everyone in its path. The room became suffocating, so someone moved to the window, pulling it open, desperate for air. The night outside was cold, but even that coldness felt kinder than what was inside. The silence of the street, the distant sound of life moving elsewhere, felt like a cruel reminder that the world had not stopped even though theirs had shattered. The moon hung heavy in the sky, pale and indifferent, watching over the ruins of what had once been a home. Tears came quietly at first, then heavier, spilling down faces that had once smiled without worry. The sound of weeping carried through the house, and it felt like walls absorbed it, holding the sorrow in place so it could never leave. No comfort was found in words because words had been the very tools that once built lies. Comfort could not exist here anymore, only the long and painful process of facing what was left behind. The hours dragged, and though the night grew deeper, no one could sleep. The mind replayed everything in circles, searching for where it all went wrong. But the answer always came back the same. It had begun long ago, in small secrets, in hidden choices, in silences that should have been broken but never were. The realization was bitter, that the truth had always been there, waiting to be seen, but everyone had looked away, choosing the comfort of denial. By the time the first light of morning touched the horizon, no one felt any lighter. If anything, the truth seemed heavier in the daylight, its shape clearer, impossible to avoid. The sun rose like it always did, but its warmth could not reach them. It was as though the day itself felt wrong, unwelcomed, unwanted. They were left with only fragments of what had been, and the sharp edges of those fragments cut deeper than any knife. And yet, even in the wreckage, something lingered. A question, unspoken but present in every heart. Where do we go from here? It was not hope, not yet, but it was a question that refused to disappear. Because even though the truth had destroyed so much, it had also left no more hiding places. The future, though terrifying, was at least no longer built on lies. Whether that future would heal or destroy them further, only time would tell. But for now, all they could do was sit in the silence, carrying the weight of everything they had lost, and slowly begin to face what still remained. The day after felt unreal, as though the world had lost its shape. Everyone moved slowly, their bodies present but their minds far away, trapped in thoughts that refused to let go. The silence was not peaceful but heavy, pressing down on the chest, making each breath harder to take. It was as though the house itself carried the echo of everything that had been revealed, replaying it over and over in its walls. Even the smallest sound seemed to remind them of the night before: the creak of a chair, the clink of a cup, the shuffle of footsteps. Nothing was ordinary anymore. In the corners of their minds, memories returned without mercy. Little details that had once been overlooked now carried new meaning, twisting themselves into proof of what had always been hidden. Every smile recalled looked sharper, every moment replayed felt poisoned. The hardest part was not just remembering, but realizing that those memories could never again feel safe. What had once been moments of comfort now became reminders of betrayal. The past itself felt rewritten, and there was no way to return it to how it once was. The conversations that followed were slow and broken. Words stumbled out, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in bursts of anger that burned and then faded into tears. No one seemed to know what to say, but no one could remain silent either. The silence was too much to bear, yet every word felt like a wound reopening. There was no right thing to say anymore, no way to ease the sharpness of the truth. All that remained was to speak, because not speaking was even worse. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Hours felt like days, and each passing moment brought no relief. Some tried to busy themselves with small tasks, reaching for anything that might make life feel normal again, but even the simplest actions carried a weight. Pouring water into a glass, folding a piece of cloth, setting something down, every action reminded them of what had been broken. The world continued outside, birds still sang, and the sky still shifted from morning to afternoon. But inside, everything had stalled. The mind searched for reasons, for something that might make sense of it all, but answers refused to come. Instead, there were only questions that circled endlessly. Why had it happened? When had it begun? Could it have been stopped? Each question carried its own sting, and none could be answered in a way that lessened the pain. Sometimes the questions turned into blame, directed at each other, at themselves, at fate. Other times the questions dissolved into silence, leaving only tears to speak. As the day dragged on, exhaustion settled in, but sleep still would not come. Every attempt to close the eyes only opened the door to more memories, more thoughts, more pain. The mind replayed the same scenes, searching for a different outcome that would never exist. Rest was impossible when every breath reminded them of what they had lost. The body ached, but it was the heart that felt most broken, carrying a weight that could not be set down. There were moments when anger sparked again, sharp and unrelenting, demanding release. Voices rose, accusations flew, but they never lasted. Anger always gave way to sorrow, to the crushing realization that nothing could undo what had been done. Anger was fire, but fire eventually burned itself out, leaving only ashes. And in those ashes, grief waited patiently, stronger and more enduring than any burst of rage. By evening, the weight of everything grew heavier still. The house was filled with shadows as the sun set, and those shadows seemed to match the ones that had settled in their hearts. Lights were turned on, but they gave no comfort. The glow was pale and hollow, unable to push away the darkness that had taken root. No one wanted to speak anymore, but the silence carried its own kind of torment. Each person felt trapped inside their own thoughts, yet bound together by the same shared pain. The night stretched long. Time felt endless, and the darkness outside seemed to seep into the rooms, wrapping itself around them. The quiet was broken only by the sound of someone weeping softly, the kind of crying that came from deep inside, where words could never reach. Others sat still, staring into nothing, their faces pale and heavy with everything they could not say. It felt as though the house itself was grieving, holding within its walls a sorrow too large to escape. And still, beneath all of it, the same question lingered. What comes next? None of them knew, and perhaps that was the cruelest part. The truth had taken everything they thought they had, but it had given nothing in return, not even a clear path forward. All that remained was a void, an emptiness that stretched as far as the eye could see. The future felt like a place they no longer recognized. a place they were being forced into without choice. But as the hours dragged into the early morning once more, a quiet thought began to rise, faint and fragile. It was not forgiveness, not healing, not even acceptance, just the simple thought that they were still here. They had survived the night before, and they had survived this day. It was the smallest of truths, but it was one that could not be denied. In a world where so much had been torn apart, even that fragile fact carried a kind of weight. They did not know how they would face tomorrow, but they knew they had faced today, and somehow that had to be enough for now. Morning came, but it felt like no morning they had ever known before. The light broke through the windows in thin, pale strands, weak and cold, as though the sun itself carried no warmth anymore. The world outside seemed unchanged. The trees still stood, the birds still stirred, the wind still moved across the earth. But inside, everything had shifted beyond repair. The air was thick with what had been spoken, with what had been revealed, and no amount of time could make it disappear. They sat in silence, each one holding the weight of what could not be undone, staring at the world as though it had betrayed them by continuing on. The faces around the table were marked with exhaustion. Eyes were swollen from tears, lips pressed tight as though holding back words that would do nothing but deepen wounds. No one reached for food, though it lay untouched in front of them. Hunger had no place in a heart so full of grief. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, as if they were no longer living but only going through motions demanded by time itself. The silence between them was not empty. It carried everything: questions unasked, regrets unspoken, and the ache of knowing that what had been destroyed could never be built again in the same way. Every glance that passed across the table seemed to cut deeper, for each pair of eyes carried its own sorrow, and looking into them was like looking into a mirror of one's own pain. It was unbearable, yet unavoidable, because turning away was no easier than facing it. When words finally came, they came in fragments. A voice here, a whisper there, broken sentences that trailed into nothing. There was no way to speak fully of what had happened, no language strong enough to contain the weight of betrayal and loss. Still they tried, because silence threatened to suffocate them. The words may have been weak, but they were the only lifeline left, fragile threads stretched between people who felt further apart than ever. Some spoke of the future, though their voices shook. The questions were simple. What now? Where do we go? How do we live with this? But the answers never came. Each possibility seemed hollow. Each thought of moving forward felt like stepping into a world they no longer recognized. There was no map for grief this deep, no guidance for hearts that had been broken so completely. All they could do was sit together in their uncertainty, bound not by hope, but by the shared truth that had destroyed them. As the day wore on, the house seemed smaller, its walls closing in, carrying every sound and every silence with equal weight. The hours passed slowly, dragging them toward evening with no sense of relief. Some wandered from room to room, restless, unable to stay still, while others sat motionless, lost inside their thoughts. No one found comfort. No one found peace. The air itself felt too heavy to breathe. When night came again, it brought no rest. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, while the darkness inside lingered in every corner. Sleep remained out of reach, chased away by the mind's relentless turning over of what had been lost. Memories played themselves in cruel repetition, twisting into reminders of what could never be reclaimed. Eyes closed, but behind them was only more pain. The body longed for rest, but the soul refused to give it. Tears came in waves, sometimes silent, sometimes raw and unrestrained. They rose without warning, breaking through in moments that seemed ordinary. A glance at a familiar chair, the sound of footsteps on the floor, the sight of a shadow moving across the wall. Everything was a reminder. Everything was a trigger. There was no escape, no corner of the house or of the mind untouched by the grief that had settled there. And yet, in that long night, there was also a strange, fragile strength. It was not loud or certain. It was not the kind of strength that promised healing or even understanding. It was simply the strength of survival, of breathing through another hour, of sitting in the darkness and refusing to let it take everything. It was the strength of hands that reached for each other, hesitant at first, but finding comfort in the smallest touch. It was the strength of voices that whispered soft words, not of hope but of presence, saying without saying, "I am still here." By the time dawn approached once more, their grief had not lessened, their questions had not been answered, and their wounds had not healed. But they had endured another day and another night, and in that endurance was a kind of quiet defiance. The truth had broken them, but it had not destroyed the fact that they were still alive, still breathing, still bound together by something deeper than betrayal, by the simple need to go on. The road ahead remained uncertain, stretching into a future they could not yet face, but for now, they had survived. That survival, fragile and trembling as it was, became the only promise they could hold on to. It was not enough to erase the pain, but it was enough to keep moving. One breath, one step, one day at a time. And in that small, flickering way, it was enough.